James Gleick, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
When we talk about information, we often talk about something going viral or a bug infecting my computer. Is it coincidence that biological language is used to talk about communication?
No, it's not. Funny you should ask. And we're so sophisticated about information these days when we talk about things going viral. You know, there's the idea that a piece of information is like a virus, like a biological organism. Richard Dawkins would say it's a meme. He invented that idea by analogy with the idea of genes. And genes themselves, we've learned, are made of information. That's sort of a turning point in history, I think, that forms the beginning of my book, when information took center stage.
By using words like viral and infection, does it imply that something is out of control?
Yes. It implies that information has a life of its own. We are not its masters. The idea of meme, again, a meme can be a snippet of music that's in your head, and we all have the experience of having a piece of music in our head and we can't get it out, or we don't know why we're humming this thing, and we feel that it's the piece of information that's in charge. And it's the same thing with a lot of ideas that go viral. It's not as if there's an organized conspiracy to say, okay, this week everybody's going to talk about the possibility that the President of the United States wasn't born in the United States. It feels as though the ideas take on a life of their own.
You mentioned the book in which you go through the history, basically, of information. Is it impossible to rank developments in information technology according to their importance? How do you measure, for example, the importance of the development of the printing press up against the development of the transistor?
You know, I think what matters now is that as aware as we are of the centrality of information, we're able to see all of these things as members of the same club. I mean, you mentioned the printing press and the transistor. And the transistor wasn't originally thought of as an information technology. In retrospect, we can see that this little bit of hardware enabled the information age that we live in. And that the printing press was also an information technology, and the telegraph, it seems obvious. Before that, the invention of writing itself was a technology of information. It was a way humans figured out to encode their language in symbolic form and preserve it for information storage, information retrieval.
Were there technologies at the time that were invented that weren't really appreciated but that we look back on now in context and see as quite revolutionary?
Yes, and not only that, a lot of these information technologies, if they were appreciated, made people uneasy. I mean, it seems obvious that the printing press is a great thing and had a great influence on human affairs. And the fact is, people were pretty quick to realize how important it was. But people also thought it wasn't such a good thing. People thought, oh my God, this flood of books that's inundating the world, now it's going to be impossible for any educated person to keep up with it all, and that's a terrible thing.
And you write in the book that this is very common whenever there's a major new technology that comes along in information, whether it's the radio or the TV, that it causes people to think, well, what does this mean for human civilization?
And I think that's a healthy thing. You know, it's normal for us to be comfortable with the technologies we have. You know, we think bicycles are just a quaint old thing, and maybe the next thing that comes along is dangerous and scary. But bicycles were dangerous and scary in their time. The telegraph was a disruptive technology. You know, people thought it was going to put newspapers out of business, which may seem funny now, because then the next thing you knew was that there were newspapers naming themselves the telegraph because they loved the technology. And now in our time we have cyberspace. Once again, newspapers are worried about going out of business, and maybe this time they have something genuinely to be afraid of. And we worry, rightly or wrongly, that the information technologies are having a dangerous effect on our ability to concentrate, on our attention spans. I think it's healthy to be nervous about the effects of technology, and yet it's okay to some extent to be sucked in.
Maybe one of the things that makes people nervous is that it seems like things are always changing ever more quickly. Are they actually?
Yes, they actually are. I mean, I say that with a caveat, which is that people have always thought things were changing more quickly than ever in the past. And maybe it's always been true. During the Industrial Revolution, people thought the world is changing at a breakneck pace. Now we have railroad trains and the telegraph. In our era, it's almost funny to think that people in the 19th century thought things were moving quickly. And it's true that the pace of technological development has never been this fast. And we have a tendency to think, well, finally, we've got to hit a wall. It can't go on like this.
But can it?
I don't know. I mean, all we can say for sure is that people have always felt this way. And I don't think people have always felt inevitably things have got to slow down. I don't see that happening.
When you've gone back through history, has there ever been a point where it has hit a wall?
No. There's never been a time when people reached a plateau and said, okay, let's back off. Let's abandon these new technologies. I mean, technologies disappear, but they don't vanish. That is, they go obsolete and maybe they're used less, but they continue to have a place. Even things like vinyl phonograph records, which appeal now to hobbyists, still have a life. There are plenty of people who think they sound better.
What about Morse code? Is that still in use, even though we can all just text each other?
Okay, fair point. There aren't too many people now who actually still know Morse code, and there was a time when people knew Morse code. I mean, there are people my age who are probably still fluent in Morse code.
I could still tap out an SOS.
There you go. I know what an SOS sounds like in my head. People don't use the telegraph anymore, so maybe that technology is obsolete, but not vanished.
Just to return to that issue about the speed, one of the things that really stuck with me reading your book that I think viewers would be interested in, you write that 3 clerks in a small room upstairs in the ferry house of Jersey City handled the entire telegraph traffic of the city of New York in 1846, and they didn't have to work very hard. That is just astounding to think that was only 160 or so years ago.
It's a technology that had early days like everything else, and the early days of the telegraph were absolutely fascinating. I mean, there's a case where people were aware very quickly that it was going to change the world, and there was a lot of noisy excitement about it. People said the telegraph will annihilate space and time. That's a cliche that sounds familiar to us because we say the same thing about the internet today. And we're right, and they were right. The telegraph really did change things very rapidly. So, and then when it went obsolete, it was because it was replaced by things that were even faster, more effective in helping people communicate. And after all, we can see that in its way, the telegraph is a specialist's technology. You had to know this code, or you had to take your message to the telegraph office where a trained operator would tap it in. Then when the telephone came along, anybody could use it.
You write that the invention of the telegraph facilitated the preservation of large quantities of minutiae, and I read recently that the Library of Congress is archiving every single tweet, for example. Are we holding on to too much minutiae?
Oh, I think we are. I say it, but I don't mean that as a value judgment. I mean that as a thing that I think we're all a little bit scared of. When you tell people that the U.S. Library of Congress is archiving all of the billions of the world's tweets, people might be forgiven for asking why. It's one thing for them to be a storehouse for the treasure that's represented by the world's books, but on the other hand, we all know that most of those tweets are complete rubbish. Most of my own tweets are complete rubbish, and I don't want people preserving them. And yet, we humans are pack rats, right? And we don't want information to vanish. And if information is discarded, the fear is that the wrong stuff will be discarded.
So, how much information is too much information? Is infinite quantities of information too much?
Well, it's not infinite. It just feels infinite. There is too much for any one person, but again, people have thought that before. So I want to be ambivalent about this. I want to say, on the one hand, if you feel you're overwhelmed, you're probably right. I mean...
and not alone.
And not alone. Nobody has an obligation to keep up with everybody else's tweets. The whole point of Twitter or any of these media is that you make choices about whom to follow. In the same way, nobody has an obligation to read all of the world's books. And if it was impossible in the 17th century, what's it like now? The feeling of being behind in one's reading is surely a universal feeling. We just have to learn to cope with the guilt. I'm still struggling.
Well, have there been any psychological studies done on information overload?
Yes, sure. People have tried to do that. Information overload started to become an expression, I guess, in the 1960s and 70s when the information age was upon us. Actually, the argument I make in my book is that all of human history has been an information age, and it's only now that we can appreciate that. And there have always been concerns about too much information, but it's now that TMI is a well-known set of initials. And sure, psychologists started to do, and sociologists started to do studies. Some of them might sound silly. You know, you can sit people down. This is something people did, and let them be problem solvers and give them a choice. Do you want more facts or just this many facts? And it turns out that universally people ask for more facts. They want as much information as they can get, which seems natural. But then the people who get the most facts in this particular psychological setup don't necessarily do better, because at a certain point, as you can imagine, there's just too much to juggle.
You mentioned before that it's not possible for any one person to have all knowledge. Is it possible for there to be physically a repository of all knowledge?
You know, what's happening today is that knowledge tends to be moving to the cloud being this semi-mythical place that we imagine over our heads in a, I guess, foggy form, where in real life we know that it's on servers. It's on physical hardware in giant air-conditioned warehouse buildings, many of them owned by companies like Google. But the reason it's kind of legitimate to think of it as a cloud is that in the nature of information these days, even if it's stored on physical servers, it's stored in more than one place. There are copies of it. And that makes it safer, paradoxically, than it was when it was just in physical form, written in books. We're not going to have a fire of Alexandria, as they did in the ancient world, where significant portions of the world's knowledge were lost forever. All the plays of Sophocles, we have a tiny fraction of what he actually wrote. I think now, in a weird way, information in the cloud is safer than it was.
That it may be safer. Is there a negative effect in that having the cloud and the replication of information in different places means that the concept of privacy, as we might understand it, is outdated?
Privacy is in danger. I don't think the concept is outdated. I think it's more urgent than ever for people to worry about it. But yes, the same people who are storing all this information in the cloud for us are storing facts about us that we were hoping would get a decent burial. And that's always been true to some extent. There are things about us that might have been a matter of public record, but for all practical purposes were gone. If people were divorced, the records of those proceedings tended to be filed, at least in some countries, and they would be filed on paper in a storeroom somewhere. And theoretically, an enterprising reporter or lawyer could dig that stuff up. But for all practical purposes, it was gone. Now, anybody can Google it, and more of that stuff that was once buried is online for everyone to see. Having
gone back in great detail through the history of information and information technology, does it leave you with any thoughts or theories about where things might go from here?
No. I hope it leaves me with a little bit of humility about making forecasts about the future. Anyone who studies any history comes across a lot of people who made fools of themselves thinking that they had crystal balls. So the only thing I can say is that I don't think we're going to go back to a time when information was less important or when people were more alone. I think for better and for worse, we're all going to be part of this informational universe. We're going to have to, if we want to cut ourselves off from it for the sake of our mental health, we're going to have to learn to do that ourselves.
James Gleick, thank you very much.
Thank you.